The sound of rushing water filled the air as the icy river swelled after days of relentless rain. In the distance, a German shepherd fought against the powerful current, his thin body struggling to stay afloat. Exhaustion was etched into every movement as his head bobbed in and out of the freezing water. Passers-by stood frozen on the riverbank, unsure of what to do. But just when it seemed all hope was lost, two brave men sprang into action. What started as a desperate rescue quickly turned into something far more extraordinary, something no one could have anticipated. This is a story about courage, survival, and an unbelievable twist that will leave you speechless. The storm had finally passed, but the aftermath was chaos. The river that cut through the outskirts of Elmsford had turned into a raging torrent, its usually calm waters transformed into a dangerous force of nature. Most residents stayed indoors, avoiding the bitter cold and the treacherous conditions. But for Jack and his brother Ethan, it was just another morning on their way to work. Driving along the winding road that paralleled the river, Jack spotted something in the water. At first, he thought it was a log being carried by the current, but as they got closer, he realized it was moving, struggling. His heart sank. "Ethan, stop the car!" Jack shouted, his voice laced with urgency. Ethan slammed on the brakes, the tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement. "What is it?" he asked, already following Jack's gaze toward the river. "It's a dog," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. They both jumped out of the car, running toward the riverbank. The scene before them was harrowing. A German shepherd was in the middle of the raging water, his paws flailing as he fought to stay above the surface. His body was thin, and his fur was soaked, clinging to his frame. The cold was clearly taking its toll. His movements were becoming weaker by the second. "We have to do something," Jack said, already pulling off his jacket. "Are you crazy?" Ethan grabbed his arm, his face pale. "That current could kill you." Jack hesitated for a moment, his eyes never leaving the dog. "If we don't try, he's going to die." Before Ethan could protest further, Jack climbed down the muddy bank and into the freezing water. The shock of the cold took his breath away, but he pressed forward, his eyes locked on the dog. Ethan cursed under his breath and followed, knowing he couldn't let his brother do this alone. The current was stronger than either of them had anticipated. Each step was a battle as the icy water pushed against them, threatening to sweep them away. Jack reached the dog first, wrapping his arms around its trembling body. The dog let out a weak whimper, but didn't resist. It was too exhausted to fight. "Got him!" Jack shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the river. Ethan reached them moments later, helping to steady Jack as they began the slow, arduous journey back to shore. Every step felt like an eternity, but finally they reached the safety of the riverbank. They collapsed onto the wet grass, the dog lying limp between them. "He's alive," Ethan said, relief washing over him as he checked for a pulse. The dog's chest rose and fell faintly, his breathing shallow but steady. Jack sat up, his hands trembling from the cold and adrenaline. "We need to get him warm, now." Without another word, they wrapped the dog in Jack's jacket and carried him to the car. The drive back to Ethan's house was tense, the heater blasting as the brothers tried to keep the dog from slipping further into hypothermia. "Do you think he'll make it?" Ethan asked, glancing at the dog in the back seat. Jack's jaw tightened. "I don't know, but we're going to do everything we can." The car sped down the icy road, the heater working overtime to fight the cold air that had seeped into the dog's fragile body. In the back seat, the German shepherd lay motionless, wrapped in Jack's jacket. His breathing was shallow, each rise and fall of his chest a faint reminder of how close he was to the edge. Jack glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "Drive faster," Jack urged, his voice tense. "I'm already pushing it," Ethan replied, glancing nervously at the slick road ahead. The icy rain from the storm had left patches of black ice, and the last thing they needed was another crisis. But Ethan pushed the gas pedal slightly harder, feeling the urgency radiating from his brother. "Hang on, buddy," Jack muttered under his breath, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the dog or himself. When they pulled into Ethan's driveway, the brothers wasted no time. Jack gently scooped the dog into his arms, his heart sinking at how light he was. He could feel the sharp outline of the dog's ribs through the soaked fabric of his jacket. "Max," because Jack had already decided that was the name he would call him, barely stirred. Inside the house, Ethan grabbed a stack of towels and a space heater, while Jack laid Max carefully on the living room floor. The warmth of the room was immediate, but Jack knew it wasn't enough. He knelt beside the dog, wrapping him in the towels and gently drying his matted fur. "He's so cold," Jack said, his voice cracking. He had never seen an animal in such a state, so broken, so vulnerable. Ethan set up the space heater and turned it toward Max. "What else can we do?" he asked, his usual calm demeanor replaced by uncertainty. "We'll warm him up first, then call the vet," Jack replied. "But for now, we just need to keep him alive." For the next hour, the brothers worked tirelessly to bring warmth back into Max's body. Jack massaged his legs, trying to stimulate circulation, while Ethan carefully spooned small amounts of warm water into his mouth. At first, Max didn't respond, his eyes remaining half closed, but eventually he began to lick the water weakly. "That's it, buddy," Jack said softly, his voice full of encouragement. "You're a fighter." When Max's body began to tremble slightly, a sign that his body temperature was rising, Jack let out a sigh of relief. It wasn't much, but it was progress. He leaned back against the couch, exhaustion washing over him, but he couldn't take his eyes off the dog. "Do you think he was abandoned?" Ethan asked after a long silence. Jack nodded grimly. "No collar, no tags, and in that condition, someone gave up on him." His voice hardened. "But we're not going to." Ethan glanced at his brother, recognizing the determination in his voice. Jack had always had a soft spot for animals, and this wasn't the first time he had gone out of his way to save one. But there was something different about this. The connection Jack felt with Max was immediate, almost instinctive. By the time the vet arrived, a local doctor who agreed to make a house call, the worst of the crisis seemed to have passed. Max's breathing had steadied, and though he was still weak, his eyes were open now, following the voices around him. The vet, a middle-aged woman with a kind smile, knelt beside Max and began her examination. "He's malnourished, dehydrated, and clearly exhausted," she said after a few minutes. "But the fact that he's still alive after everything he's been through says a lot about his spirit." Jack felt a wave of relief, though he knew Max wasn't out of the woods yet. "What can we do to help him?" The vet smiled gently. "You're already doing it. Keep him warm, feed him small, frequent meals, and let him rest. He's going to need time to heal, both physically and emotionally." As the vet packed up her bag, she turned to Jack. "You saved his life tonight. Most dogs in his condition wouldn't have made it." Jack nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He looked down at Max, who was now resting his head on the towel, his eyes half closed but no longer filled with fear. "I didn't save him," Jack said softly. "He saved himself. I just gave him a chance." That night, as the brothers sat in the living room, watching over Max, a quiet determination settled between them. They had pulled him from the brink of death, but the journey ahead would be long, and Jack was ready to see it through, no matter what it took. The first night with Max was both hopeful and nerve-wracking. Jack stayed awake on the couch, his eyes trained on the German Shepherd lying near the fireplace. Max was bundled in blankets, his breathing steady but shallow, and every so often, Jack would check to make sure his chest was still rising and falling. Ethan had gone to bed hours ago, though not without repeatedly telling Jack to get some sleep himself. But Jack couldn't. There was something about Max that kept him tethered to the dog's side, as if leaving him alone for even a moment might cause him to slip away. Around 3 a.m, Max stirred. Jack immediately sat up, watching as the dog's head lifted slightly from the blanket. His eyes were open now, more alert than before, though still filled with exhaustion. He turned his gaze toward Jack, who was frozen in place, unsure of what to do. "Hey, buddy," Jack whispered, leaning forward slowly. "You're okay. You're safe." Max didn't move at first, but his ears twitched at the sound of Jack's voice. After a moment, he lowered his head back onto the blanket, his body relaxing slightly. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and leaned back against the couch. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The following morning, Ethan found Jack in the exact same spot he had left him, still keeping watch over Max. He shook his head with a small smile, walking into the kitchen to make coffee. The smell of brewing coffee filled the room, and soon after, Jack finally roused himself enough to join his brother. You're going to burn yourself out if you don't sleep, Ethan said, sliding a mug across the counter. I'll sleep later, Jack replied, taking a sip. His voice was hoarse from the long night, but there was a spark of determination in his eyes. I just want to make sure he's okay. Ethan glanced toward the living room, where Max lay motionless. He's a tough dog, he said. If he survived that river, he can survive anything. Jack nodded, but his worry lingered. He knew Max's physical recovery would take time, but it was the emotional scars he was most concerned about. The way Max flinched at sudden movements, the hollow look in his eyes. It all pointed to a past filled with pain and neglect. Throughout the day, Jack focused on helping Max feel comfortable. He brought him small portions of food, sitting close by as Max tentatively sniffed the bowl. It took a few tries, but eventually, Max began to eat, his movements slow and deliberate. Jack couldn't help but smile as he watched the dog take his first real steps toward recovery. Good boy, Jack murmured, his voice full of encouragement. You're going to be okay. Ethan joined them in the living room later that afternoon, sitting on the floor a few feet away from Max. He watched as Jack gently stroked the dog's head, his touch careful and deliberate. You've always had a soft spot for strays, Ethan said with a grin. Remember that time you brought home a kitten you found in the dumpster? Jack chuckled softly, not taking his eyes off Max. Yeah, but this is different. He needs us. Ethan's smile faded slightly as he nodded. You're right. He does. Over the next few days, Max began to show small signs of improvement. His appetite increased, his breathing steadied, and he started to move around the house more. He was still wary of sudden noises and hesitant to approach Ethan, but he followed Jack everywhere, his trust in the man growing stronger with each passing day. One evening, as Jack sat on the floor beside Max's makeshift bed, the dog did something that caught him completely off guard. Max shifted closer to Jack, his head resting against the man's leg. It was a simple gesture, but to Jack, it meant the world. You trust me, don't you? Jack whispered, his hand resting gently on Max's head. The dog didn't move, his eyes half closed as he relaxed against Jack's touch. Ethan walked into the room, stopping in the doorway when he saw the scene before him. Looks like you've got yourself a shadow, he said with a grin. Jack smiled, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. Max still had a long way to go, but this moment, this quiet act of trust, was a sign that they were on the right path. The morning sun broke through the thin layer of fog, casting soft golden light across the yard. The warmth of spring was beginning to creep in, melting the last remnants of snow and replacing them with patches of damp grass. For the first time since Jack and Ethan had rescued Max, Jack decided it was time to take him outside. Max had been recovering well over the past week. Though still thin and frail, his ribs weren't as pronounced, and the patches of fur that had fallen out were beginning to grow back, soft and fuzzy against his skin. Jack had been cautious about pushing Max too hard too soon, but he could see that the dog was growing restless. He wanted to give him a taste of freedom, the first he might have felt in a long time. Standing by the back door, Jack grabbed a leash. What do you think, Max? Ready for some fresh air? Max, lying on his bed by the fire, tilted his head at the sound of Jack's voice. Though he was still hesitant with new experiences, there was a glimmer of curiosity in his eyes. Jack crouched down, holding out his hand. Come on, buddy, he coaxed gently. You've got this. Slowly, Max rose to his feet. His movements were stiff, his body still adjusting to the strength he was slowly regaining. Jack clipped the leash onto his collar and opened the door, stepping outside into the crisp morning air. Max hesitated at the threshold, his paws barely touching the cold wood of the porch. It's okay, Jack said softly, giving the leash a gentle tug. I'm right here. With cautious steps, Max followed Jack outside. The cool air ruffled his patchy fur, and he sniffed tentatively at the ground, his nose twitching as he explored the unfamiliar scents. Jack watched him carefully, giving him plenty of space to move at his own pace. Ethan appeared in the doorway, a mug of coffee in hand. I'll admit, I didn't think he'd leave the house this soon, he said, leaning against the frame. Jack shrugged, his eyes still on Max. He's tougher than he looks. The yard was fenced in, offering a safe space for Max to wander without fear. He moved slowly at first, his thin legs shaky under his weight. But with each step, he seemed to grow more confident. Jack followed him, keeping a loose grip on the leash, but letting Max lead the way. Max stopped near a patch of grass, his nose pressed to the ground as he sniffed intently. Jack crouched beside him, smiling as he watched the dog's curiosity take over. "You like it out here, don't you?" Jack said, scratching behind Max's ears. The dog's tail gave the faintest wag, and Jack's smile widened. It wasn't long before Max began to explore more of the yard. He moved with cautious determination, his head low as he sniffed every corner. At one point, he looked up at the sky, his ears perking slightly at the sound of birds chirping in the distance. For a moment, Jack could see a glimpse of the dog Max used to be, a dog filled with curiosity and wonder, not fear and pain. But just as quickly as the moment came, it was interrupted. A car passed by on the road behind the house, its engine loud and sudden. Max froze, his body stiffening as his ears flattened against his head. Jack immediately knelt beside him, his hand resting on the dog's back. "It's okay," Jack said softly, his voice steady and calm. "You're safe. Nothing's going to hurt you." Max's breathing was shallow, his eyes darting toward the sound of the car. But after a few moments, he turned his gaze back to Jack. The fear in his eyes began to fade, replaced by something that resembled trust. "That's my boy," Jack said with a smile, scratching under Max's chin. "You're doing great." Ethan, still watching from the doorway, shook his head in amazement. "He's a completely different dog," he said. "I don't know how you do it, Jack." Jack stood, his hand still resting on Max's back. "It's not me," he said. "It's him. He just needed someone to give him a chance." As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Max began to relax. He sniffed at the flowers growing along the fence, his tail wagging slightly as he explored the yard. Jack stayed close, his heart swelling with pride at every small step Max took. This was the first time Max had truly experienced freedom since Jack and Ethan had pulled him from the icy river. It wasn't perfect. There were still shadows of his past that lingered, moments of hesitation and fear. But today, Max had taken his first steps toward a brighter future. And for Jack, that was more than enough. Over the next few weeks, Max continued to grow stronger. His once skeletal frame began to fill out as he put on weight, and his fur, though still patchy in some areas, was soft and beginning to shine. Jack dedicated every moment he could to Max's recovery, from preparing nutritious meals to sitting with him during quiet evenings by the fire. The bond between them deepened, and even Ethan, who had been more reserved, found himself drawn to Max's resilience. But not everything was easy. Max's fear of sudden noises and new situations still lingered, a reminder of whatever horrors he had endured before Jack and Ethan found him. While he trusted Jack completely, there were moments when the past crept back into his mind, paralyzing him with fear. One such moment happened on an unassuming Thursday afternoon. Jack had decided to take Max on a longer walk, hoping to gently expose him to more of the world beyond their quiet yard. The path they followed wound through a wooded area near the house, a favorite spot for Jack where the sounds of nature provided a peaceful escape. Max walked beside him, his leash slack as he sniffed at the ground. His steps were steady, his tail wagging faintly, and for the first time, he seemed almost carefree. Jack smiled, his heart swelling with pride as he watched Max take in the world around him. "You're doing so well, buddy," Jack said, his voice soft. "You're stronger every day." They reached a clearing where the trail opened up to a small, quiet park. A couple of kids were playing with a soccer ball in the distance, their laughter echoing through the air. Jack watched Max's ears perk up at the sound, but instead of shrinking back as he might have before, Max tilted his head curiously. Jack knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "See, nothing to be afraid of." But just as the words left his mouth, a loud engine roared from the nearby parking lot. A car backfired, the sharp noise cutting through the peaceful afternoon like a gunshot. Max froze, his body stiffening as fear overtook him. His tail tucked between his legs, and his breathing became rapid and shallow. "Max, it's okay," Jack said quickly, his hand moving to the dog's back. "It's just a car." But Max didn't seem to hear him. He tried to pull away, his movements frantic as he looked for an escape. Jack tightened his grip on the leash, keeping his voice calm and steady even as his heart ached for the dog's obvious distress. Hey, Jack whispered, crouching down to Max's level. "I've got you." You're safe. No one's going to hurt you. Max's wide, panicked eyes met Jack's, and for a moment, it seemed as though the dog was lost in the shadows of his past. But then, slowly, Jack saw a flicker of recognition in Max's gaze. The tension in his body eased slightly, and he took a hesitant step toward Jack. That's it, Jack said softly, his hand resting gently on Max's side. You're okay, buddy. I'm right here. It took several minutes, but eventually Max's breathing slowed, and he lowered his head, leaning into Jack's touch. Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and wrapped his arms around the dog, holding him close. You're so brave, Jack murmured. I'm so proud of you. Ethan, who had come along for the walk and had been watching from a distance, approached cautiously. Is he okay? He asked, his voice low. Jack nodded, glancing up at his brother. Yeah, he just needs time. They decided to head back home, cutting the walk short. Jack kept a steady hand on Max's leash, speaking to him softly the entire way. By the time they reached the house, Max was calm again, though he stayed close to Jack's side, his trust in the man evident in every step. That evening, as Max lay by the fire, Jack sat beside him, his hand resting on the dog's head. He thought about how far Max had come, how much progress they had made together, but he also knew that healing wasn't a straight line. There would be more moments like today, more reminders of the pain Max had endured. But Jack wasn't going anywhere. He had made a promise to Max the day he pulled him from the river, and he intended to keep it. Max wasn't just a dog. He was family, and family didn't give up on each other. As Max drifted off to sleep, his body relaxed and his breathing steady, Jack smiled. The road ahead might be long, but they would walk it together, one step at a time. The next morning, the sun rose over the small town, casting a soft glow through the trees. Jack woke early, the smell of fresh coffee brewing in the kitchen. He glanced over at Max, who was curled up on his bed near the fireplace, his breathing slow and steady. Even in sleep, Max's progress was evident. His body, though still lean, looked healthier, and the patches of fur that had begun to grow back now gave him a softer appearance. Jack smiled as he walked over to the kitchen where Ethan was sitting with a steaming mug of coffee. You're up early, Ethan remarked, raising an eyebrow. Couldn't sleep much, Jack admitted, pouring himself a cup. I've been thinking about Max and how far he's come. It feels like he's ready for the next step. Ethan tilted his head, intrigued. What kind of step? I want to take him to the lake, Jack said. He hasn't been near water since we pulled him from the river, but I think it's time. He needs to face that fear, and I want to be there to help him. Ethan hesitated for a moment. You sure that's a good idea? What if it's too much for him? Jack's expression softened as he glanced toward Max. I'll take it slow. If he's not ready, we'll stop, but I think he's stronger than we give him credit for. Later that afternoon, Jack and Ethan loaded Max into the truck and drove to the lake, a quiet spot on the outskirts of town where the water was calm and clear. The area was mostly empty, with only a few families picnicking in the distance. Jack parked the truck and climbed out, opening the back door for Max. Come on, buddy, he said, holding out his hand. Max hesitated for a moment before stepping down onto the soft grass. His ears twitched as he took in his surroundings, his nose sniffing the air. Jack could see the tension in his body, but there was also curiosity, a good sign. They walked slowly toward the edge of the lake, the leash loose in Jack's hand. Max's steps were cautious, his head low as he sniffed at the ground. When they reached the water's edge, he stopped, his body stiffening slightly. It's okay, Jack said gently, kneeling beside him. You're safe. Nothing's going to hurt you. Max looked at Jack, his eyes searching for reassurance. Slowly, Jack reached out and dipped his hand into the cool water, letting it drip from his fingers. See? He said, smiling. It's not so bad. Max sniffed at the water, his ears flicking back and forth. He took a tentative step closer, his paws brushing against the edge of the lake. Jack watched him carefully, ready to pull him back if he showed any signs of distress. But instead, Max surprised him. He lowered his head and lapped at the water, his movements hesitant but calm. Ethan, who had been standing a few feet away, grinned. Well, would you look at that? The brave guy's doing it. Jack chuckled softly. I told you he was tougher than he looks. For the next hour, Jack let Max explore the area at his own pace. The dog walked along the shoreline, his nose constantly sniffing the air and the ground. At one point, he even stepped into the shallow water, his paws splashing softly as he tested the unfamiliar sensation. Jack felt a surge of pride as he watched Max conquer one of his greatest fears. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the lake, Jack sat on the grass with Max by his side. The dog's body was relaxed, his eyes bright and alert. Jack scratched behind his ears, smiling. "You did amazing today," he said softly. "I'm so proud of you." Max leaned into Jack's touch, his tail wagging faintly. In that moment, Jack realized just how far they had come. The dog, who had once been too weak to stand, too scared to trust, was now finding his strength, both physically and emotionally. That night, back at home, Max curled up by the fire, his body stretched out in a way that showed just how comfortable he had become. Jack sat nearby, watching him with a smile. Ethan walked into the room and leaned against the doorway, a mug of tea in his hand. "He's a different dog," Ethan said quietly. "I didn't think it was possible." Jack nodded, his gaze never leaving Max. "He's not just a different dog. He's showing us what it means to fight, to never give up." Ethan smiled and took a sip of his tea. "You've done something incredible, Jack." Jack shook his head. "No, Max did it. I just gave him the chance." As the fire crackled softly, Jack felt a deep sense of peace. Max's journey wasn't over, but he had taken another step toward a life filled with love and safety. And Jack knew, without a doubt, that they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, together. The weeks following Max's trip to the lake were transformative. The once fragile German Shepherd now walked with confidence. His steps steady, his head held high. His coat, though still showing a few scars from his past, was full and healthy, glowing in the sunlight. Max wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving. For Jack, watching Max's transformation felt like a gift. Every small milestone was a reminder of how far they had come together, and every wag of Max's tail was proof of the trust and love that had grown between them. But more than that, Max had changed Jack too. He had taught him patience, compassion, and the power of never giving up. One afternoon, Jack decided to take Max back to the river, the same river where his journey had nearly ended. It wasn't an easy decision. Jack knew it might bring back memories for Max, but he also believed it could be a moment of closure, a chance for Max to finally leave the past behind. Ethan joined them, offering silent support as the three of them walked along the riverbank. The air was crisp, the water much calmer than it had been that fateful day. Max trotted beside Jack, his leash loose in Jack's hand. He seemed at ease, his nose twitching as he took in the familiar scents of the area. When they reached the spot where Jack and Ethan had pulled him from the freezing water, Max stopped, his ears perked up, and for a moment he stood perfectly still, staring at the gentle current. Jack knelt beside him, resting a hand on his back. "This is where it all started," Jack said softly. "Do you remember?" Max turned his head, his deep brown eyes meeting Jack's. There was no fear in his gaze, no hesitation, only trust. Jack smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You're not the same dog you were that day," he continued. "You're stronger now, braver, and I'm so proud of you." Max let out a soft bark, as if responding to Jack's words. Ethan chuckled from a few feet away. "I think he knows," he said. Jack gave Max a final scratch behind the ears before standing. "Come on, buddy, let's keep moving." They continued their walk along the river, the sound of the water providing a peaceful backdrop. As they made their way back to the truck, Jack couldn't help but reflect on everything Max had taught him. He had gone into this journey thinking he was rescuing a dog, but the truth was, Max had rescued him too. That evening, as the sun set over the horizon, Jack and Max sat together on the porch. The sky was painted in shades of orange and pink, and the air was filled with the soft hum of crickets. Max lay at Jack's feet, his head resting on his paws, his body completely relaxed. "You know," Jack said, breaking the quiet, "I don't know who abandoned you or why they gave up on you, but I'm glad they did, because it brought you to me." Max's tail wagged faintly, and Jack smiled. "You're family now, and no one's ever going to give up on you again. I promise." As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Max let out a deep, contented sigh. Jack reached down, resting a hand on his back. In that moment, the world felt perfect. Two souls who had saved each other, bound by a love that couldn't be broken. Max's journey from the brink of death to a life filled with love and safety wasn't just a story of survival. It was a story of hope, of second chances, and of the unbreakable bond between a man and his dog. And as they sat there together, bathed in the quiet light of the stars, it was clear that this was just the beginning of a beautiful new chapter for both of them. Max's story reminds us all of the power of second chances and the unbreakable bond that forms when love and compassion are given freely. From the brink of death to a life filled with hope, his journey proves that no life is too far gone to be saved. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who believes in the power of resilience and love. Together, we can inspire more incredible stories like this one.